The sound carried for miles. A low, rolling thunder that had nothing to do with weather. The concussion of a surface-to-air missile, finding an American jet at 30,000 feet over the Red River Valley. Colonel General Vladimir Abramov's Soviet advisory team tracked the kill from a command bunker outside Hanoi in the autumn of 1966, and what they saw confirmed everything they'd been telling Moscow for months. The Americans were flying the same routes, at the same altitudes, against defenses that grew denser every week. The advisors logged each shootdown with clinical precision: bearing, altitude, missile type, whether the pilot ejected. They were building a data set, and the data set said the Americans were losing. Before going any further, drop a comment with what you think was the most dangerous aircraft assignment in Vietnam. Watch this to the end and see if you were right. Hit like if the numbers surprise you, and subscribe if you want more stories. The Air Force doesn't put on recruiting posters. The Soviets had reason for confidence. By 1966, their SA-2 guideline batteries around Hanoi and Haiphong had multiplied from a handful of sites to over 200, and the Vietnamese crews manning them were getting sharper with every engagement. The advisory reports sent back to Moscow noted a particular American aircraft type appearing again and again in the wreckage tallies. A big, fast, single-engine fighter bomber that the Americans kept sending into the most heavily defended airspace on the planet. The reports didn't use the American designation. They used the NATO codename and physical descriptions, but the aircraft was unmistakable. Nothing else in the American inventory was that large, that loud, that fast in a straight line, or that committed to flying level during a bomb run. The Vietnamese gunners and missile crews learned its profile the way a hunter learns the silhouette of a specific bird. They knew when it was coming and which corridors it would use because the Americans kept telling them through sheer repetition, and they could predict exactly where it would be and when. The final accounting is brutal. 382 of these aircraft were lost during the war, gone entirely, destroyed in combat, shot down by missiles and anti-aircraft fire, crashed on return from missions over the north, written off after limping back to bases in Thailand with damage beyond repair. Nearly half of all the airframes ever built ended up as wreckage scattered across North Vietnam, Laos, the jungle karst of Route Package 6, the rice paddies south of Hanoi. The pilot loss rate exceeded that of every other fixed-wing aircraft in the American arsenal, worse than the Phantoms. Worse than the Skyhawks flying from carrier decks, worse than the slow-moving A-1 Sky Raiders doing close air support in the south, worse even than the reconnaissance jets threading through the densest flak corridors alone. One aircraft type absorbed a staggering share of the war's aerial casualties, and the men who flew it knew the math before they ever strapped in. The actuarial tables were not subtle. A pilot assigned to this aircraft in 1966 had roughly a 50-50 chance of completing a full combat tour without being shot down, killed, or captured. Coin flip odds applied to every man in the squadron. The bomb bay was the tell. No American fighter since World War II had an internal bomb bay, and yet there it was, a cavernous weapons compartment built into the belly of a fighter aircraft, sized precisely to carry a single Mark 28 hydrogen bomb. Everything about the Republic F-105, Thunderchief traced back to that cavity in its fuselage, and everything that made the aircraft both extraordinary and lethally vulnerable in Vietnam started there. Republic Aviation began the design in 1951 under a project designation that told the whole story: AP-63, an advanced tactical fighter bomber built around nuclear strike. The mission profile was straightforward in concept and suicidal in practice. A single pilot would fly alone at treetop altitude across Eastern Europe, penetrate Soviet air defenses at supersonic speed, deliver a tactical nuclear weapon on a predetermined target, and, if the math worked out, escape the blast radius before detonation. The aircraft didn't need to dogfight, it didn't need to loiter, it needed to go fast, go low, carry one very large weapon internally to reduce drag, and get in and out before the MiGs could react. Republic's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian émigré who'd been designing fighters since the P-47 Thunderbolt, understood the physics and drew an aircraft that was essentially a missile with a cockpit. The dimensions were staggering for a single-seat fighter, 64 feet long, over 50,000 pounds at combat weight. The Pratt & Whitney J75 engine produced 26,500 pounds of thrust in afterburner, making it the most powerful engine fitted to any fighter in the world at the time. The fuselage used area ruling, a narrow waist pinched between the wing roots, to reduce transonic drag, giving the aircraft its distinctive Coke bottle shape. At low altitude, the Thunderchief could exceed the speed of sound, which in 1955 was a remarkable achievement for something that weighed as much as a loaded World War II medium bomber. Republic built 833 of them. The Air Force took delivery through the early 1960s and stationed them across Europe and Asia, forward deployed for the nuclear mission they were designed to execute. Pilots trained for single-ship low-level penetration runs across simulated Soviet terrain, practicing toss bombing maneuvers that would loft a nuclear weapon upward while the aircraft pulled into a half-Cuban 8 escape maneuver. The training was intense and narrowly specific, and completely irrelevant to the war that was about to find them. When the Johnson administration escalated the air campaign against North Vietnam in 1965, the Air Force needed a fighter bomber that could carry heavy conventional ordnance loads over long distances from bases in Thailand. The F-105 fit the requirement on paper. It had range and speed. It had that bomb bay, which could carry an auxiliary fuel tank for the long overwater transit or a modest conventional payload. And critically, it was available in numbers. The Tactical Air Command wings at Korat and Takli Royal Thai Air Force bases received their Thunderchiefs and began flying Rolling Thunder missions almost immediately. The mismatch between design and mission was apparent from the first sorties. An aircraft built to make one pass at Mach 1.1 against a Soviet radar site was now flying repeated daylight strikes against the same targets in North Vietnam, in formations, at medium altitude, following predictable ingress routes dictated by rules of engagement written in Washington. The bomb bay that was supposed to carry a city killer now carried 6 750-pound conventional bombs. External pylons added more ordnance but also added drag, which cut speed, which increased time over target, which increased exposure to ground fire. Every design choice that made the Thunderchief perfect for nuclear war made it something else entirely over Hanoi. The pilots called it the Thud. The nickname was equal parts affection and gallows humor, a reference to the sound the aircraft supposedly made when it hit the ground, which happened with increasing frequency as 1965 turned into 1966. Jack Broughton, who commanded a Thud squadron at Takli, put it plainly in his memoir, "We were using a cannon to do a rifle's job, and the cannon was pointed at us half the time." The irony was not abstract to the men flying the Thud. They sat inside it every morning at engine start. Takli sat 155 miles north of Bangkok in the flat rice country of Nakhon Pathom province, surrounded by nothing in particular: paddies, water buffalo, a few villages where farmers pretended not to notice the supersonic aircraft screaming off the runway at dawn. Korat was 130 miles to the east, similarly unremarkable from the ground, similarly deafening from anywhere within 5 miles. Both bases officially didn't exist. The State Department maintained the fiction that Thailand was not being used as a staging ground for offensive combat operations against North Vietnam, a position so transparently false that even the Thai government found it embarrassing. American reporters were discouraged from visiting. Mail home carried APO addresses that obscured the location. The Pentagon referred to missions originating from Thailand with the wonderfully bland phrase, "out-country operations." The men living at Korat and Takli knew exactly where they were and what they were doing there. 2 wings of F-105s, the 355th Tactical Fighter Wing at Takli and the 388th at Korat, carried the overwhelming majority of the Rolling Thunder bombing campaign against North Vietnam from 1965 through 1968. Between them, these 2 wings flew more strike sorties into Route Package 5 and Route Package 6, the heavily defended zones around Hanoi and Haiphong, than any other units in the theater. The mission tempo was punishing. During peak periods, a pilot might fly 2 sorties a day into the same defended area, landing with empty pylons and shaking hands, debriefing for an hour, then walking back to the aircraft for an afternoon go. A standard 100-mission tour took roughly a year to complete. The word standard did a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, because the attrition rate meant most squadrons turned over their entire pilot roster well before 12 months elapsed. Ken Bell, an F-105 pilot at Takli in 1967, put it bluntly, and he wasn't talking about the tropical heat. You'd come to the club on a Friday night, and there'd be 4 empty chairs that were full on Monday. Nobody talked about it. You just moved the chairs. The club he meant was the officers' bar, where the unwritten rule was simple: drink if you want, grieve if you must, but be at the briefing room by 4:30 a.m. The mission cycle didn't pause for casualties. Replacement pilots arrived from the States with minimal theater orientation, sometimes flying their first combat sortie within 48 hours of stepping off the transport. Korat and Takli consumed pilots the way an engine consumes fuel, steadily, mechanically, and without anyone marking the occasion. 7,000 anti-aircraft guns. That was the Pentagon's own estimate for North Vietnam's air defense network by mid-1967, a figure that made the airspace around Hanoi the most heavily defended territory on Earth since Berlin in 1945. The comparison went beyond rhetoric. The geometry of the problem was identical. A known attacker, flying predictable routes into layered defenses that grew more lethal with every passing month. The layers worked together. At low altitude, below 3,000 feet, optically aimed small-caliber guns created a carpet of steel. 12.7 mm, 14.5 mm, 23 mm weapons positioned along river crossings, rail lines, every choke point the Vietnamese could identify. Go higher to escape the small stuff, and you entered the medium altitude band between 4,000 and 15,000 feet, where radar-directed 37 mm and 57 mm batteries waited. Their Soviet-supplied fire control systems could track an aircraft automatically and predict its flight path with disturbing precision. Above that, the SA-2s owned the sky from 15,000 feet up to about 60,000, each missile carrying a 390-pound fragmentation warhead that didn't need a direct hit to kill. A near miss was sufficient. Shrapnel from a guideline detonation could shred hydraulic lines, puncture fuel cells, sever control cables, blow apart engine components, any one of which turned a Thunderchief into a very expensive lawn dart. And then there were the MiGs, North Vietnamese fighter interceptors, primarily MiG-17s and the newer MiG-21s, operated under tight ground control intercept procedures taught by Soviet and Chinese advisors. They didn't freelance. Hanoi's GCI controllers would vector them into position behind an American strike formation, wait until the thuds were committed to their bomb run, wings level, speed stable, altitude locked, and then clear the MiGs to attack from the rear quarter. The timing was deliberate. A thud pilot in his bomb run couldn't maneuver without missing the target, and missing the target meant flying the whole mission again tomorrow. The North Vietnamese understood this perfectly. The declassified tactical assessments from Hanoi's Air Defense Command show a system designed around one core insight. The Americans would come back to the same targets, along the same corridors, because Washington required them to. Colonel Tran Han, who commanded MiG operations during Rolling Thunder, described it years later in terms that were almost dismissive. We knew their schedule better than they did. He wasn't exaggerating. The rules of engagement imposed from Washington turned tactical aviation into something closer to a bus route. Strike packages were assigned specific ingress corridors. Deviation was not permitted. Pilots could not attack SAM sites unless the sites fired first, a restriction that meant flying past active radar emissions and hoping the crew below hadn't yet pushed the launch button. Certain areas were designated as off-limits entirely. The port of Haiphong, where Soviet freighters unloaded SAM components in plain view, was surrounded by a restricted zone that American aircraft could not enter. MiG airfields were similarly protected until late in the campaign. A thud pilot could watch a MiG-21 take off from Phuc Yen, knowing it would try to kill him in 15 minutes, and do absolutely nothing about it. The route structure into Route Package 6 funneled strike formations through a narrow set of approach corridors northwest of Hanoi. Thud Ridge, the pilots called the prominent karst ridgeline they used for navigation and partial terrain masking. Every Vietnamese gunner within 40 miles knew about Thud Ridge. They positioned their batteries accordingly. The predictability was so extreme that anti-aircraft crews could pre-aim their weapons at specific points along the ridge and simply wait for the formations to appear on schedule. If the Thud wings had been allowed to vary their tactics, randomize timing, approach from unexpected vectors, hit the air defense network itself rather than the approved target list, the calculus might have shifted. The operational flexibility existed in the aircraft. It did not exist in the chain of command. 7th Air Force requested it. Pacific Air Forces endorsed it. The Joint Chiefs debated it. The White House denied it. The geometry stayed fixed, and the guns stayed aimed at the places where the thuds would be. Captain Hayden Lockhart rolled in on the Zombong ammunition depot at 14,000 feet and never saw the round that hit him. His F-105 took a 57mm shell through the aft fuselage on the pull-off, lost hydraulic pressure almost instantly, and became uncontrollable somewhere over the karst ridges west of the target. Lockhart ejected. He landed in a rice paddy, was captured within hours, and spent the next 8 years in Hoa Lo prison. He was the first Air Force pilot taken prisoner during Rolling Thunder. though the distinction meant nothing to him at the time. He was just trying to survive the landing. March 2nd, 1965. The date matters because it was supposed to be a demonstration of American resolve, a carefully calibrated signal to Hanoi that the United States would escalate if the North continued supporting the Viet Cong insurgency. The target list reflected the calibration. Zom Bong was an ammunition storage area roughly 35 miles north of the demilitarized zone, chosen because it was militarily relevant enough to justify the mission, but far enough from Hanoi to avoid provoking the Soviets or Chinese. The strike package was large by the standards of early 1965. 44 F-105s from Korat, supported by F-100 Super Sabres, flying flak suppression out of Da Nang, with KC-135 tankers orbiting over Laos for the post-strike refueling. On paper, it looked overwhelming. 40-plus fast movers against a supply depot defended by what intelligence estimated as a handful of automatic weapons positions. Intelligence was wrong. The Vietnamese had reinforced the area with radar-directed 37mm batteries that weren't on any American target folder. The guns opened up as the first flight rolled in, and the volume of fire stunned pilots who had never seen anything like it. Lieutenant Robert Baird's F-105 was hit on his bomb run and went down near the target. He didn't get out. Captain Smitty Harris, flying another Thud, took heavy damage and ejected over hostile territory, captured the same day as Lockhart, eventually ending up in the same prison. 2 F-100s from the flak suppression flight were also knocked down. Captain Hayden Lockhart, Captain Smitty Harris, Lieutenant Robert Baird, Captain Robert Carlson, Lieutenant Bui Pham Truc. The names accumulated before the first mission was even fully debriefed back at Korat. 5 aircraft destroyed, 4 men killed or missing, 1 captured who would later die in captivity, another who would endure nearly 3,000 days as a prisoner. All of this on day 1, against a target that wasn't even particularly important. The after-action reports from that first mission used language that would become numbingly familiar over the next 3 years. Heavier than expected resistance. Defenses exceeded pre-strike intelligence estimates. Losses within acceptable parameters. That last phrase, acceptable parameters, appeared in a 7th Air Force summary document dated March 4, 1965, 2 days after the mission. The men at Korat read it and said nothing printable. The acceptable parameters would eventually consume 395 F-105s and more than half the pilots who flew them. But on March 2nd, the numbers were still small enough to count individually, and every name belonged to someone who had been eating breakfast in Thailand that same morning. The scramble horn at Takli made a sound like a dying animal, a rising, warbling wail that cut through the tropical heat and the hangar noise and the conversation in the ready room all at once. On the morning of August 7, 1966, it went off before most pilots had finished their coffee. The mission board showed targets in Route Package 6. The weather briefing said scattered clouds over the Red River Valley, visibility adequate. Nobody in the 355th wrote down what they were thinking. 5 Thuds didn't come back that day. The losses came in clusters. 2 aircraft went down over the target area within minutes of each other, hit by 57mm fire during their bomb runs. A third took an SA-2 proximity burst on egress and broke apart at altitude. The pilot ejected into a fireball of JP-4 and tumbling wreckage. A fourth limped south trailing smoke before the engine seized somewhere over the karst. The fifth made it across the Black River before the pilot lost control authority and punched out into the jungle canopy. Of the 5 men, 2 were killed outright. 2 were captured. 1 was rescued by a helicopter crew that took ground fire during the extraction and barely made it back to friendly territory themselves. The 355th had launched 16 aircraft that morning. Losing 5 meant a 31% attrition rate on a single mission. Sustainment math doesn't work at 31%. At that rate, a squadron of 18 pilots would be statistically eliminated in fewer than 4 missions. The wing operations officer reportedly stared at the recovery board for a long time that evening, counting the tail numbers that hadn't returned, then walked to the officers' club without saying a word. They called it Black Sunday. The name stuck because the arithmetic behind it was impossible to ignore any longer. A 100-mission tour, flown at the average loss rate of roughly 1 to 2% per sortie, produced cumulative odds that hovered right around 50-50 for survival. Certain months were better, and others were catastrophically worse. August 1966 was the worst month of the entire war for the Thud wings. 11 F-105s lost in 31 days. Jack Broughton, the vice-wing commander at Tockley, wrote about that period with a flatness that conveyed more than anger could. We were losing a pilot a day and being told the campaign was succeeding. The replacement pipeline kept the squadron rosters full. New names appeared on the board, and empty chairs appeared in the club, and neither process ever seemed to pause. Jack Broughton flew the ridge at 500 knots and 50 feet, close enough to see individual trees blur past the canopy rail. The karst limestone spine running northwest from Hanoi toward the Chinese border rose sharply from the valley floor, jagged, jungle-covered, tall enough to mask an aircraft from the Fansong radars operating in the flatlands around Thud Ridge. That was the name the pilots gave it, and the name told you everything about who owned that particular piece of sky. The ridge worked as a shield, but only barely. A Thud formation approaching Hanoi from the northwest could tuck against the eastern slope, using the terrain to break radar line of sight with SAM batteries positioned south and west of the city. The Fansong radar needed continuous tracking to guide an SA-2 to intercept. Break the track for even a few seconds and the missile went stupid. Ballistic, unguided, a telephone pole flying on momentum alone. Pilots learned to hug the ridge during ingress, popping over the crest only when they were close enough to the target to begin their roll-in. The maneuver bought them maybe 90 seconds of reduced exposure. 90 seconds was worth a great deal when the alternative was 4 minutes of straight and level flight through the densest SAM coverage on Earth. The technique demanded something close to insanity. At 500 knots, 50 feet above a limestone ridge in a 40,000-pound aircraft with no terrain-following radar, a moment of inattention meant controlled flight into terrain. The Thud had no automated ground avoidance system. The pilot's eyeballs were the system. Broughton described the sensation in his memoir as flying inside a tunnel with no lights and no certainty of where the walls were. The turbulence off the ridgeline could slam the aircraft into a roll without warning. Downdrafts could push the nose toward the rocks faster than a pilot could correct. And all of this happened while the man in the cockpit was simultaneously monitoring his radar warning receiver for SAM launches, tracking his position relative to the target, maintaining formation spacing with the other aircraft in his flight, and mentally rehearsing a bomb delivery sequence that would last approximately 12 seconds. The nickname itself carried weight the Air Force Public Affairs Office preferred to ignore. Republic Aviation had christened the aircraft Thunderchief. The pilots called it the Thud. The origin story has competing versions. Some say it came from the sound the aircraft made hitting the ground during the type's early accident-prone years at Nellis, when the F-105 had a landing mishap rate that bordered on the comical. The ejection seat in early D models had a reputation for unreliability, and the joke at Nellis was that you could identify an F-105 by the sound it made at the end. Others trace the name to a 1950s comic strip character, a caveman called Thud, which somehow attached itself to the big ugly fighter in the way that military nicknames do, without logic, without authorization, and without anyone remembering exactly when it stuck. The official history of Tactical Air Command contains no entry for the word. The pilots used it exclusively. By 1967, the name had transformed. What started as gallows humor became something closer to a badge. To say you flew the Thud meant you flew Route Pack 6. It meant you had done the ridge run, had watched the SAMs come up through the undercast like white fingers reaching for your aircraft, had rolled in on a target defended by weapons that could track you and predict you and kill you before you ever saw the launcher. Thud driver wasn't a job description. It was shorthand for what you were willing to do and what you expected to happen to you while doing it. The men who flew the ridge knew the mathematics from Black Sunday hadn't changed. 1 to 2% per mission, compounding across a 100-mission tour, still produced the same coin flip survival odds. What changed was how they carried that knowledge. Ken Bell, a Thud pilot at Korat, who completed his 100 missions in 1967, didn't dress it up. You stopped thinking about the odds after about mission 20. You either accepted it or you couldn't fly anymore. There wasn't a third option. The ridge didn't care about acceptance. It stood where it had always stood. Limestone and jungle and the sound of Pratt and Whitney J75 engines echoing off the karst at dawn. The pilots flew it because the geometry demanded it, and the geometry never changed. The Wild Weasels had the worst job in the Air Force, and they volunteered for it. While every Thud pilot flying Route Pack 6 faced the SAM threat, the Weasel crews went looking for it. The mission profile was insane on paper. Fly ahead of the strike package, provoke the Fansong radars into transmitting, then kill the SAM sites before the bomb-laden single-seaters arrived. First in, last out. The motto wasn't aspirational, It was procedural. The two-seat F-105F carried an electronic warfare officer in the back seat, who monitored the APR-25 and 26 radar homing and warning systems, calling out threat bearings while the pilot maneuvered to localize the emitter. Once they had a fix, the attack profile was a diving run directly at the SAM site, straight into the engagement envelope of the weapon they were trying to destroy. The Weasel carried AGM-45 Shrike anti-radiation missiles that homed on the fan song's signal. If the Vietnamese shut down the radar, the Shrike went stupid. If they kept transmitting, the Shrike killed them. It was chicken at 600 knots. The Vietnamese operators learned fast. On March 10, 1967, Captain Merlin Dethlefsen flew into the steel mill complex at Tay Nguyen as part of a Weasel flight, supporting one of the largest strike missions of Rolling Thunder. His flight leader was shot down almost immediately. The No. 3 aircraft took heavy damage and turned south. Dethlefsen pressed the attack alone, making repeated passes against active SAM sites while under simultaneous fire from MiG-21s and 85mm guns. He destroyed 2 sites before running low on ordnance and fuel. The Medal of Honor citation uses the word extraordinary twice. The mission report is more specific. It notes he sustained battle damage on his second pass and continued anyway. If the Weasels hadn't existed, strike force losses over Route Pack 6 would have been far worse, possibly bad enough to force a suspension of operations over the Hanoi area entirely. The North Vietnamese understood this. SAM operators were specifically instructed to prioritize the two-seat F-105s. Back to the men who flew them. Leo Thorsness earned his Medal of Honor on April 19, 1967, during a mission near Xuan Mai. He destroyed one SAM site, damaged another, then shot down a MiG-17 during the same sortie, all while critically low on fuel. 11 days later, Thorsness was shot down and captured. He spent 6 years in Hanoi. "We knew what we were getting into," a Weasel EWO told an interviewer decades later. "The airplane told you. The backseat rattled like a snake den every time they lit us up." Colonel Robert Scott flew his last combat mission over Route Pack 6 on October 15, 1968, as part of a 4-ship out of Korat. When he landed and shut down the J-75 for the final time, the crew chief painted a red X through the aircraft's tail number on the scheduling board. The jet wasn't broken, there just weren't enough F-105Ds left to fly. The numbers were worse than any operational language could disguise. Of the 833 F-105s built by Republic Aviation, 395 were lost in Southeast Asia, nearly half the entire production run. Another 61 were destroyed in stateside accidents during the same period, many involving replacement pilots rushing through abbreviated training programs designed to feed the pipeline faster. The combined losses exceeded the total number of aircraft in the active inventory at any single point during the war. Republic had stopped building the Thud in 1964. There was no production line to restart. Every airframe destroyed was subtracted from a fixed number that only moved in one direction. By the autumn of 1968, the 355th Tactical Fighter Wing at Takli was operating at a fraction of its authorized strength. Squadrons that should have had 18 aircraft were flying with 11 or 12. Maintenance crews cannibalized parts from battle-damaged jets that would never fly again, stripping hydraulic actuators and avionics boxes from hulks parked at the edge of the ramp. The smell of hydraulic fluid and scorched metal hung over the flight line, a permanent, acrid sweetness that maintenance troops said they could taste on their tongues for years afterward. The decision came down from 7th Air Force Headquarters in November. The F-105D would be withdrawn from combat operations in Southeast Asia. The F-4 Phantom would absorb the strike mission entirely. On paper, the transition was described as a force modernization. The declassified planning documents use phrases like force structure realignment and capability migration. The operational reality was blunter. The Air Force had run out of Thuds. The single-seat D model became the only American combat aircraft in the Vietnam War removed from theater, primarily because attrition had consumed the fleet. The F-100 and the F-4 had both taken losses, but neither was pulled from the fight for lack of airframes. Only the Thud earned that distinction, and it earned it because the missions assigned to it were the missions most likely to kill the men flying it. The two-seat F-105F told a different story. 66 of the G and F Weasel variants had been built, and losses among them were severe, but the Wild Weasel mission couldn't be handed off to the Phantom. The F-4 lacked the integrated radar hunting avionics, and more critically, It lacked crews trained in the specific madness of flying toward a SAM site rather than away from one. The Weasel Thuds stayed. They continued flying combat missions over North Vietnam and later over Laos and Cambodia until 1974, 6 years after the single-seat variant disappeared from the war. Some of those airframes had been repaired so many times that crew chiefs joked about the aircraft being more patched than original metal. The last F-105Ds left Thailand without ceremony. No flyover, no formation salute. Ground crews loaded toolkits and personal gear onto C-130 transports, while the remaining thuds were ferried back to the States, most of them destined for Air National Guard units, where they would serve out their remaining structural life flying peacetime intercept missions over places like Indiana and New Jersey. A pilot who had flown 87 missions over Route Pac 6 might find his old aircraft parked on a guard ramp in Burlington, Vermont, repainted in a clean gray scheme with no evidence of what it had done or where it had been. They just quietly went away, a Tockley maintenance officer recalled. One week we had a wing of fighters, next week we were sweeping out the hangars. 382 pilots killed, captured, or missing. 395 aircraft destroyed. The F-105 Thunderchief had been designed to carry a single nuclear weapon in a single pass against a single target in a war that never came. Instead, it flew 500,000 conventional sorties in a war that wouldn't end, against defenses it was never meant to face, under rules of engagement that guaranteed the attrition would continue. The coin had been flipped for every man who climbed into that cockpit. Roughly half of them lost, 46%. That was the final number for F-105 airframe losses in Southeast Asia, 395 of 833 built. No other American combat aircraft in the jet age has approached that ratio. The A-4 Skyhawk lost 262 airframes, but Douglas built nearly 3,000 of them. The F-4 Phantom lost 445, from a production run exceeding 5,000. The Thud's losses were concentrated in a fleet so small that every shootdown moved the needle visibly toward zero. The air-to-air record needs its own accounting. Thud pilots scored 27.5 confirmed kills against MiGs during Rolling Thunder, a number that surprises people who think of the F-105 as purely a mud mover. Most of those kills came with the M61 Vulcan cannon, the same 20mm rotary gun